morning and welcome to Morning Movie News. And when it comes to movie news, Marvel Studios make so many movies these days that they can easily dominate the headlines, which they are doing so today with the first two stories about Marvel films. And then let's level up to Disney, which owns Marvel Studios, and they own so many different properties at this point that they can really dominate the headlines. And sure enough, the third story today is about Star Wars, another Disney property. But the viewer question remains independent. All right, so let's start out with this first story that made quite a noise on the internet yesterday, and that is the announcement, or, not so much an official announcement, but it's been uncovered that Marvel Studios has a new rule, no more origin stories, and that's going to have an immediate effect on the Doctor Strange movie. While it was originally going to be an origin story, it will no longer be so. When the film starts, Stephen Strange will already be the Sorcerer Supreme. And people quite aren't sure how to feel about that. A number of you actually wrote me about this and asked me for my thoughts on it. Thank you very much for thinking of me. And Jean in particular pointed out that Doctor Strange has a really great origin story. And you know what? I'd like to add that not only is it a very good, unique origin story, because, he wasn't bitten by something, he didn't, find some magical, mystical amulet. Well, he kind of did to some degree, I guess. But still, it's an older origin story. He's not a teenager. It's not the typical Joseph Campbell, with puberty becomes great powers. Just like Tony Stark, which I think also is a very, Robert Downey Jr. has turned into a very interesting character, of course, with Jon Favreau's help. Poor Jon Favreau, no longer a part of that franchise, although that franchise has basically become the Avengers. We'll talk about that actually a little bit, the Robert Downey Jr. black hole of the Marvel Cinematic Universe with today's second story. But anyway, I think Doctor Strange has a lot of potential because he's such a mature character. And so for those of you who aren't aware of his origin story, he starts out as a brilliant neurosurgeon, but he's a jerk because he feels he's God's gift to science and man. But then he gets into a car accident and his hands are horribly mangled. He can no longer perform surgery. Now, I guess maybe with today's evolving technology, Tony Stark could be like, here, just talk to this robot and it will be your hands. And then Doctor Strange would never exist. So actually, considering the advancements that are made in technology, and this is a universe where Tony Stark and his technology exists, maybe that will need to be addressed. Or maybe that's why they're skipping the whole origin story thing. They're like, whatever, he's the Sorcerer Supreme. But anyway, in the comics, when Doctor Strange was first created, when your hands were broken, that was the end of your career as a surgeon. So he tried to find a way to maybe fix it, and of course he turned to the dark arts, the mystical arts. But it ended up showing him a new path, redeeming him personally to become a better person, and to kind of become a mystical surgeon and become a doctor of the mystical arts, Doctor Strange. Great origin story, very well done, and I think it would be interesting to bring in the magic elements. They're working very hard to bring in the cosmic elements with Guardians of the Galaxy into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. What about the mystical ones? I've talked about, and I think some of you like this idea as well, of having Scarlet Witch pop up in the Doctor Strange movie, which is why I think it's being fast-tracked while we're still wondering where our Black Widow and Black Panther movies are. We're like, why Doctor Strange? And I think that's to build up the Scarlet Witch character, who I'm almost certain will show up there. And maybe that's another reason it's not an origin story, come to think of it, because why would she be involved in that? I think they want to just have him show up and help her, maybe train her in her powers. So then it's really the Doctor Strange Scarlet Witch movie, which worked wonders for Captain America the Winter Soldier, which was really a Captain America Black Widow movie. And Nick Fury, I think, to some extent, which was great. But anyway, to lose that origin story, what that really means is that if you're going to do this and you're going to do it right, that's going to require flashbacks and also excellent, sophisticated writing that's able to allude to past circumstances and take care of a lot of exposition and character definition through scenes without seeming clunky. And that takes a very experienced screenwriter. Even sometimes the most experienced screenwriters can't pull off tricky screenwriting like that, to get so much done without it seeming, to make it seem effortless. And that's very hard to do. And the guy that's working on the Doctor Strange script, this new version, is someone I don't really know if he could do this. His name is John Slattery, and his biggest gig to date, he's actually pretty hot right now. He has a lot of upcoming projects, but of the films that he's written that have actually come out, the big one is Prometheus. And Prometheus did a horrible job in that regard. It was actually laughable in its plot holes and things that happened a little bit too easily. And I think the script was the weak point of that film. The reason Prometheus is so well thought of is because of the amazing visuals, Ridley Scott's direction. It's tying into Alien, of course, and Blade Runner. And then, of course, Michael Fassbender's brilliant performance, which is evidenced by the fact that Prometheus 2 is rumored to be just about a whole bunch of Davids, which is awesome. But John Slattery isn't the kind of guy, I mean, if Marvel wanted to do this, this, I would say, hey, you know what? Go find a screenwriter who's been working like since the 70s and 80s, particularly the 70s when they made a lot of movies like this. Get those guys who write those epics, or go find Amanda Silver and Rick Jaffa, the screenwriters. Well, they're too busy working on Avatar and fixing that mess, but they wrote the two Apes movies, and they're very good science writers. So I would like to see somebody that skilled handle a Doctor Strange movie. But that's not what we're getting. We're getting the Prometheus guy. So I'm just curious as to what you think of this decision to change it up and not do an origin story. I feel bad we're losing that, but I can understand it now that I think of it in the context of wanting to include Scarlet Witch, which I think is important for the film. And I think it's important to start doubling up these superhero movies instead of one-offs, because once you introduce a team element, it's really kind of hard to go back to the singles, as we saw with Iron Man 3 and Thor: The Dark World, where it was conspicuous that the other Avengers were not present. All right, so that's the first story of the day. The second story is, of course, another Marvel movie, as promised, and that's Ant-Man. Ant-Man has just begun production. Peyton Reed is so excited. It's his ticket to the big time. He thought he had been torn up years ago by Hollywood because he'd made so many bad movies, but he really benefited from the fact that nobody wanted to stab Edgar Wright in the back and take his job. But Peyton Reed was like, it's the only chance I'm ever going to get Edgar, and he took it. So they've started filming, but there's a rumor going around about who's going to be included in the film. And also, speaking of flashbacks, which we just talked about with Doctor Strange, it's also rumored that they're going to be heavily integrated into the film because they want to flesh out Hank Pym's past, the Michael Douglas character. And I think they're going to make him somebody who is on par with Howard Stark. And sure enough, John Slattery, who played Howard Stark in Iron Man 2, you might recall from that film where he was introducing the Stark Expo to Tony, and Tony watched it, his absentee father. It was a kind of a Walt Disney homage. They had a lot of elements of that, turning Howard Stark into a Disney figure, he had his darkness as well. I think it's a very sophisticated, interesting way to use the Disney image, and I like it a lot. It's a Disney company, so I guess they can do it. But he's definitely been officially cast in the film. So expect a flashback, and maybe they'll smooth out Michael Douglas's face with computers like they like to do over to Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen in the X-Men films. But they also did with Sylvester Stallone recently in Grudge Match. It's a small little boxing movie. If you go watch, they had some old scenes, and they just kind of like did that whole thing where they erased all the lines in Sylvester Stallone's face, or they took like old footage of him and put it together to create this shot. But I don't know if I want to see Michael Douglas relegated to a background character, the old guard, if you will. But also Dominic Cooper might show up in the film as well, of course, played even younger Howard Stark. So I think that the attempt is to say, well, you haven't heard of Hank Pym yet, but he's been around. Look at this, reveal, surprise, he's been a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe for decades. He's gonna, and I think is gonna also obviously set up the eventual Robert Downey Jr. Michael Douglas scene where he's like, I knew your dad, and I can become maybe a surrogate dad to you because your dad's not around anymore, and it gives me more scenes. Because of course everything, as I said, has to relate to Robert Downey Jr. It's the Robert Downey Jr. black hole of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He is the center of it. Everything and every character in every movie ties to him. And I think you're seeing that right here with Ant-Man bringing in a Stark, Howard Stark, and as I said, eventually I'm sure Tony Stark when Hank Pym goes and talks to him. I'd love to see a Robert Downey Jr. Michael Douglas scene, but Paul Rudd's like, hey, aren't I Ant-Man? Why am I being left out here? And they're like, you're no Robert Downey Jr. So I'm curious to see if this can work, but as I said, I don't want to see Douglas sidelined to the old guard. I don't want to see him pull a Bruce Wayne in Batman Beyond where he just sits at a monitor and he's like, Paul Rudd, jump high, jump low, push the button on your suit, and does a whole lot of banter. I think that Michael Douglas, considering the technology that he'd have ready to him as Hank Pym, could still contribute actively to the super heroics going on here. And that would be exciting to me. I mean, it was great to see Robert Downey Jr. and Glenn Close basically walk through their respective Marvel movies, but I want more from Michael Douglas, especially considering he's playing Hank freaking Pym. So I'm curious to see what you think. And do you think that Michael Douglas will play the younger versions of himself in these scenes, or do you think they'll recast? He has an older son, although I do believe his son is still in jail. I'm not sure, actually, off the top of my head. He was arrested for drug distribution, because you don't get that long a sentence just for doing drugs. So very serious, and he's like in hardcore jail. Cameron Douglas, I believe, is the name. But if he was out, he'd make a good young Michael Douglas. But we'll see. I don't want to see Michael Douglas, as I said, pull a Glenn Close and Robert Redford here. And I'm curious to how you guys feel. Do you want just Paul Rudd and Evangeline Lilly to be the stars of this movie? Are you excited about a Paul Rudd, Michael Douglas team up. And what do you think of Robert Downey Jr. sticking his finger into yet another Marvel movie and property? All right, so that's the second story of the day. The third story is that Star Wars story. And it's a small story, but I think it speaks to, a mindset that we're seeing and, whether or not it's helpful or destructive. So anyway, Rian Johnson, some people told me it's pronounced Ryan. Rian Johnson, the director of Looper, Brick, he got, of course, the Star Wars Episode 8 and 9 gigs. He's going to take over the franchise, or this trilogy at least, from J.J. Abrams. And they were talking to him, and he was doing some comments with the press. And he was like, oh, isn't it great to see all the practical special effects they're doing on Episode 7? I'm definitely going to do that as well. And they said, somebody asked him, they said, well, how do you feel about directing these movies coming up? And he said, I thought I'd be terrified, but I'm just happy. And to me, I heard that, and I was like, uh-oh, you need that fear in the pit of your stomach to keep you in line. Now, as a studio executive, I'd be like, don't be so happy. You owe me a hit movie. You owe me a good job because I'm taking quite a risk on talent like yourself who's never worked at this level with Episode 8 of the frickin' Star Wars franchise. So there's that, the responsibility to the employer. But even more so, where's the responsibility, the fear of letting down the franchise and the fans? That's a tremendous responsibility, and I think that every filmmaker, especially when dealing with these kind of properties they didn't create, when you're playing with someone else's toys, and at this point toys owned by the collective group, you need to be respectful. Maybe because he's not fully working on it yet, he's just in that happy stage, but I would be, considering how much the prequels kind of went off track, although I know some of you like to defend the prequels, but overall people aren't happy with those, who wants to make another prequel? I mean, it showed that being a Star Wars movie isn't enough. That's what I think the prequels showed. It showed that just slapping on some, Star Wars lightsabers and some theme music isn't enough to win audiences over anymore. They're not going to give you a pass, nor should they. So Rian Johnson shouldn't feel, hey, I'm making Star Wars Episode 8. Everyone loves my movies. It's going to be great. Just, guys, get ready for this. I'd be like, Looper didn't do great at the box office. Brick, not fantastic. Brothers Bloom, total bomb. You have your cult fans, but you've never really reached over into the mainstream. And, you should be a little nervous as to whether or not you can do it. I'm not saying he can't, but where's the fear? I don't think a totally happy, blissed out filmmaker is a good thing. I think you need, even any person in sports, if you were about to go on the field and you were like, are you excited to play the Super Bowl? And your team was like, no, you know what, we're just happy to be here. You'd be like, oh my God, we're going to lose. You need that fear of failure, that fear of loss to really, keep you on your toes, to make you razor sharp. And so I want to know why Rian Johnson doesn't have that. And how do you feel? Would you be concerned hearing that? Are you concerned hearing it? Or are you like, oh, God bless Rian Johnson. I have total faith in him too, and I'm just happy to see him taking over. So that's the third story of the day, and I'm curious to see what you think of that. Now let's go on to that independent viewer question, which comes from Val Torrio. And Val says, hey Grace, I have a question, and I'm hoping you have time to answer it. I do! Val asks, it's something I've wondered about for quite some time now. I have a few friends who read the book If I Stay and are worried that the film adaptation starring Chloe Grace Moretz, hits theaters this Friday, won't be like the book. When Hollywood makes film adaptations of popular books, how come they don't always stay true to the book? Why do they feel like they need to change certain aspects such as plot when the original was obviously so successful? Thanks, smiley face. Great question, Val, and I think it has an interesting answer, which is why I picked it today. Now, on the one hand, I do want to point out, though, that the Harry Potter books were very loyal to the source material, I think to a fault, because you're talking about different mediums. A book is something you read, and writing for a book, I discussed this recently about documentaries versus narratives. It's a different talent to write for different mediums. So when you're writing for a book, it does not necessarily and probably doesn't translate to a screenplay. So, and also you're talking about something you read versus something you see. So that's also very different. So changes need to be made. And I think, the Harry Potter films, the books were so dense that the films, a lot of times, you'd be like, well, that doesn't really make sense, and I don't understand why that's so important, and I don't see where that character is coming from. And a common response to those complaints would be like, well, if you read the book, you totally know what was going on. But, the films are supposed to stand on their own. They're not a visual companion to the books. Or maybe they are. But you know what? It doesn't matter. It's a moot point because they've just made so much money and they're so successful. And they were so cozy that, you'd be like, you know what? I don't totally understand what's going on, but I'm just happy to be here. That's why they succeeded. But, a smaller film like If I Stay that doesn't have that same safety net of coziness and brand and franchise recognition. So, but why do they change things? As I said, things have to be told a different way. They don't work as well visually. There's no way to tell a character would be feeling that way because we don't have an inner monologue. Sometimes there's voiceover, but that's rare in film, and you certainly can't use it to the extent that you do in a book, where you're most likely usually inside a character's head. So you have to, like, you be like, well, the person thinks that in the book, but it's going to sound awfully hokey if they say it out loud in the movie. So different things have to be added. So in those instances, I appreciate the changes that screenwriters make to books when they're being responsible, when they care about the story, its core highlights, and they want to do the best adaptation possible. That's when you have a good adaptation. And so sometimes changes come from a good place, and that's why, to facilitate the material and to maybe even to some degree elevate it and to just transfer it to a different medium. But sometimes, Val, people are just jerks, and they want their ego stamped all over this project. They're like, why should I just look like I just, basically like with 2 fingers typed out the screenplay of this great book, and all the credit will go to the author? I want to come in here and change it up. I want to make what interests me. The very scary, wouldn't it be cool if you've ever had an editor, for instance, you don't want an editor who wants to be a writer. You don't want a studio executive overseeing your film who wishes they were a filmmaker, because they won't stop just meddling and touching your stuff. They don't respect your creative vision because they're like, well, you're there, but I'm secretly going to try and do everything for you. It's a horrible situation to be in. And so when you get a screenwriter who's like, you know what? Screw this writer, I want to be the star here, I'm going to change it all up. And also sometimes the director will come in and do the same thing and say, well, you know what, I want this gig, it comes with a big paycheck, it comes with a lot of publicity, but you know what, I don't really love the book. And what really interests me is XYZ, so let's integrate that in. That's why it's so important to pick the right talent to handle your property, because you want them to be a right fit to avoid this. But sometimes they don't do that. Sometimes, Hollywood will get a name talent and say, well, you know what, we want this person to direct because everyone will be excited to see them making this movie because it's such a mismatch with their talents. But then you get kind of a mess because you're like, well, it's not a match. And then also actors will come in and they'll go, well, I'm a big name, but I don't, look at Robert Downey Jr. Again, let's bring him back. Let's revisit that. Look at the havoc he is wreaking on the Marvel properties because of his contract and his wanting to be the focal point of the cinematic universe. That's having a huge effect. And that right away, comic books, same as Val said, it's a book being change. So that's another instance. So it really comes down to either, there are two reasons that it happens, Val: servicing the story to the best of the abilities of those involved, and ego. All right, so I hope that answers your question a little bit. We'll see if I stay as faithful to the book this weekend. Thank you so much for your question, Val. Thank you everybody for tuning in today. Please write down below what you think of today's top 3 stories and the viewer question, anything you'd like to see covered tomorrow, and any questions that you might have. Thanks for watching. Bye.